You guys, I enjoy watching you worship. It's cool to sit this way so we can see each other and worship. So thank you for your heart for worship and for God. You know, back in August, we went to Disney World, and we stopped in at the Tiki Bird Hut show. And if you're not familiar with the Tiki Bird show, it's 3D animated birds that talk and sing, and they do a show. And at the end of the Tiki Bird show, the birds invited everyone to stand up, and I believe everybody in the audience stood up. And then the birds invited us to clap along with the song, and about half of us clapped. And then the birds said, now everybody dance. And of everybody in the audience, there was only one person who danced. It was a woman with salt and pepper colored hair, and she was in probably, I guessed her in her 60s, and she had Down syndrome. And she danced. The birds said dance, and she took them literally and seriously. And while the rest of us were getting our belongings together, she danced. And while others were quickly trying to shove their way to be the first ones out, you know, because at Disney that's very important. You always be first. And so they were trying to force their ways out. She danced. And in fact, she would probably be still dancing today had not the people who had brought her group had insisted that she leave. And as she exited, she danced. And I thought about that, and I wondered why the rest of us didn't. I mean, all of us heard the music. We all heard the birds say, dance. We all were there to assumingly have fun at Disney. And so why did she dance and we didn't? And it's not like she set the standard too high. I mean, her dance was from the heart, and her dance was fun, but even I could do it. She did this. This is what she did the whole time. She did that, and she was having a ball. We could have all done that. Why didn't we dance with her? But regardless of the reasons why we would all give, and I would have given for why we didn't dance, one thing was certain. All of us may have had a good time in the Tiki Bird Hut. But for the one who danced, her time was all the better. And I believe with all my heart that is the same thing that is true in life. For those of us, no matter if life is good or bad, for he or she who learns to dance in the good or the bad, life is always better. Psalm 30, verses 11 through 12, I feel like are just a powerful testimony. It's on the back of your bulletin if you want to look at it, but I'll read it to you. It says, God, you turn my wailing into dancing. You remove my sackcloth or my garment of grief, and you clothe me with joy, that my heart may sing to you and not be silent. O Lord my God, I give you thanks forever. Now you read the rest of this psalm and you understand the context out of which he is writing these words of praise. He is facing enemies. And his enemies were determined that they either kill him or that he would wish that he were dead. You got any enemies like that? You know, maybe they're not even people, but you can have enemies that are disease or financial problems or relationship difficulties. And this guy had enemies that wanted him dead or wanted him to wish that he were dead. And in response to all of this, somehow inside of him, he found from God the ability to say honestly and truly, you have turned my wailing into dancing. You have removed my sackcloth and clothed me with joy, that my heart may sing to you and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give you thanks forever. Now, I do not know for you if life right now is good or bad, but one thing is for sure. Those who let God, somehow, someway, in his amazing love and power, turn wailing into dancing, life is simply better like that. How do we do that? The Bible talked about last week when we were looking at what the Scripture said. It says that we live in a sin-broken world, and that means you are broken, and I am broken. There's no person, it's not the person sitting next to you that is broken. You, in fact, yourself, I am broken. We are a broken people. And God's response to our brokenness is a promise of restoration from the inside out. And just because God restores me, though, and just because I say, oh, Lord, forgive me, and come into my life, and be God of my life, and lead me and direct me, and let me walk in relationship with you, just because I say that doesn't mean that I've yet learned to dance with God. Everyone else in the Tiki Bird Hut, remember, they didn't dance, but only one did, even though we were all invited. And so we can ask ourselves the question, what's the deal, God? You know, I've asked Christ to be the forgiver of my sin and the leader of my life, so why am I wailing and not yet dancing? What's going on with that? And what if the answer to that question is that God's promise to restore brokenness is only fulfilled, is only one side of God's plan of restoration? What if God's restoration in you does not reach its fullness until what God does in you is allowed to flow out of you? In fact, what if the extent of which God is allowed to do something in you, freedom, healing, peace, joy, wholeness, what if the extent of which God is allowed to do something in you is determined by your willingness or unwillingness to let Him do something through you? What if the reason that so many Christ followers are just as miserable and grumpy and mean and hateful as anybody else who doesn't even know Christ is because we have learned to hear the music of God in us, but we haven't let it play outside of us so that we can dance in the good and the bad with Him? But hear God's music and get up and dance with Him. And life starts to take on new meaning. And life starts to get a little more enjoyable. And all of a sudden we watch God take ordinary, even difficult moments and turn them into divine appointments. Jesus came not just to invite us to dance, but to show us how. John chapter 4 is an awesome example of that. Jesus is so tired one day. It shows us how human. We forget, Jesus was not only fully God, but He was fully human. And in His humanness, He was so tired. He was so worn out. He was starving. He was hungry. And He told His disciples, I can't even take another step. I'm going to sit here by the well. You guys go into town and get kosher takeout. And then you bring it to me and we'll eat together. So Jesus sits down and He leans against the well, and you can just see Him just beginning to close His eyes and get some much deserved and needed rest. And all of a sudden a woman with a less than wholesome reputation shows up. And that's putting it nicely and kindly. Jesus in His day, men weren't even supposed to talk to women in public, let alone a woman like this woman. And she shows up, and Jesus initiates conversation with her. We don't think much about it, but this is crazy. Jesus shouldn't do this. And He initiates conversation with her. Long story short, by the time she left there, she thought she came to the well to have her physical thirst quenched. She left the well with her spiritual thirst quenched. And the scripture picks up at verse 28. And it says in John chapter 4, verse 28, Then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, Come and see a man who's told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ? And they came out of the town and made their way toward Him. And meanwhile His disciples urged Him, Rabbi, eat something. But He said to them, I have food to eat that you know nothing about. And His disciples said to each other, Could someone have brought Him food? My food, said Jesus, is to do the will of Him who sent me and to finish the work of the Father. And the disciples are sitting there scratching their heads saying, Who brought Jesus food? Just a minute ago, He's depleted, He's tired, He's worn out, He can't even move. And now He's up on His feet and He's refreshed and He's rejuvenated and He's excited and He looks like He just ate from a buffet. Who brought Him food? How did He get food between the short amount of time we're gone? Who brought you food? And Jesus says, I have a food to eat that you know nothing about. I have something that fills me up. I have something that gets me going. I have something that picks me up when I'm down that you know nothing about. It's about when I get to be used by God to do His work and other people find God's amazing love. Do you want something better in life? You want to watch God turn wailing into dancing? And pray for and watch for and seize ordinary, even difficult moments as divine appointments. Michelangelo, the famous artist, was in his early 30s. The Pope invited him to Rome to complete a special project. He eventually asked him to come and sculpt a papal tomb. And then he changed his mind and said, instead, let's have you paint a few figures on the ceiling of the Vatican Chapel. And Michelangelo, his first love was sculpting, and he was tempted to turn it down because not only did he like sculpting a whole lot better than painting, but also a small chapel wasn't his idea of a great venue. But the Pope urged him to accept, and so finally it did. In fact, it's interesting that some historians think that maybe Michelangelo had some of his jealous contemporaries telling the Pope, come on, get Michelangelo to do this, because deep down they knew he wouldn't, or so they thought, and they thought that would get him in disfavor, and back then that would just ruin your career. But Michelangelo accepted, and he began this mundane work of painting a few figures on the Vatican Chapel ceiling.